Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Archive. Today we'll be talking about the various methods that can be used to kill Space Marines, Terminators, and Custodians. This is not going to be a huge video, as a lot of this is ground that we have already covered, but there are a couple of important things that we need to go into before we discuss how to get rid of these demigods on the battlefield. The first one is baseline resistances. What can we not use? Well, let's talk about armor first. Now, I've gone over these in our averages video, but just as a quick recap, the Marine's armor protection on his maximum for kinetic is 85 millimeters at maximum on his shoulders and on his breastplate, and it's a minimum of 35 millimeters on areas like his gauntlets, thighs, and helmet. That's kinetic, aka not against energy weapons. Now, for energy weapons, on the other hand, his breastplate and shoulders are up to 160 millimeters of protection. Very significant. And even the weakest portions of the armor, including the helmet, will protect him from 60 millimeters of energy penetration. Very, very significant. Protective against a lot of energy weapons in 40k. In addition to this, he has quote-unquote redundant organs. Now, in reality, a lot of these organs are not redundant in the traditional sense, aka if the Marine loses a lung or a heart, he's not able to operate at exactly the same level that he would be if he had all of the organs he needs to survive. Now, this does not mean that he will die instantly, however, and that's kind of the main point. Outside of the brain, there are a lot of portions of the Marine that can get partially wounded or even totally destroyed, and it won't instantly kill them in the same way that it would a human. So it's something that we have to take into account. The next one is improved toxin resistance. Now, the Marine's body is not invulnerable to poison, and it's certainly not even resistant to the more virulent poisons and toxins, and diseases as well. But in addition to having the oolitic kidney, they are naturally quite resistant to a lot of different normal poisons, and their armor, in addition to that, can create pressure zones that prevent their armor from getting infiltrated by a lot of different toxins. So, while it is possible to damage a Marine using toxins and poisons, it's not a recommended method because it's quite difficult to find one that will work and then to correctly administer it to the Marine. The next one is immortality. Can you really wait out a Marine? Well, according to the original lore, no. A Marine would remain at least combat effective regardless of how long he has been alive. Now, with modern lore, there's subjective portions to that and disagreements on how quote-unquote immortal the Marine might actually be. However, in general, you can't really wait out a Marine for 100 years and expect them to die of old age. That's just not going to happen. Resistance to pressure. Can you throw a Marine out of the airlock and kill him instantly? Not with the armor on, unfortunately, and it's quite difficult to kill the Marine with the armor on using the vacuum of space, even. So, it is not really a good option. The other one that you might think of is, well, put them underneath a high-pressure water. Nope, doesn't work either. The armor will protect and insulate them from even ocean depths of water. They might have difficulty moving around, and they certainly can't swim, but yeah, you're not going to crush them with water pressure, unfortunately. The next one is extreme strength. Well, can you outpower a standard Marine? Well, on average, the standard Marine is twice as powerful, if not more powerful, than the average Imperial Guardsman. So, basically, limb by limb, the Marine in his armor is going to be twice as powerful as the average well-built human. Which means that you could imagine how it feels to fight two people at the same time, except it's all of his organ and muscular systems that are all twice as strong as the average human. So think of it less as fighting two people and fighting a person who is twice as strong as you. AKA, it's significantly more difficult overall. So, pure strength, unless you're an Ogren, it's quite difficult to purely outstrength a Marine. Psychological condition and extreme training regimens. Now, this basically goes into the idea of, well, can you starve or demoralize a Marine and defeat them that way? While there are effects that can cause Marines to break in morale and even to go completely insane, it's very difficult to cause a Marine to surrender using pure psychological tactics. It has happened, and it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult, and we're talking about efficient ways to kill the Marines here, not unreliable ways like psychological methods. And their extreme training regimen also means that leaving them out in the cold or in difficult conditions or withholding food from them is also not going to be all that easy because Marines can eat a lot of different materials and they also have the Betcher's gland to melt down materials to then eat them. So, that's not really a great way either. Moving on to Custodes and Terminators. Now, naturally, it's all of the above bonuses, plus the following changes in the armor. The Custodian has Auramite and Adamantium for his armor protection, giving him a significant bonus over the average Marine. His shoulder and breastplates protect him up to 132 millimeters of kinetic protection. That is enormous. That resists some anti-tank guns at range, where the standard Marine armor would not. And even at its bare minimum, it's still 58 millimeters, protecting it against most anti-tank rifles, even if you were to shoot a Custodian directly in the head. So, pretty significant armor buff there over standard armor. And then for energy protection, it is of course even better, with 170 millimeters of energy protection on their chest and shoulders, and 70 millimeters on their arms, legs, head, etc. For Terminators, we're now going to the absolute maximum of physical protection. On the shoulders and breastplate, 170 millimeters of kinetic protection, significantly more than the Custodian, and 70 millimeters of protection on the arms and legs. So, still very thick, multiple inches of solid ceramite and steel or adamantium in some cases. And then for energy protection, the Terminator is basically a walking super heavy tank in terms of energy protection, with 320 millimeters of energy protection on their breastplate. That basically makes them immune to even las cannon shots directly to the chest. Not saying it's not going to knock the wind out of them and maybe injure them, but it is at least not going to get a through-and-through kill on a Terminator more often than not. However, on the legs, arms, and the head, it can resist it with 100, or it doesn't resist the las cannon with only 120 millimeters of energy protection. Still, twice the protection of the standard Space Marine in general. However, in addition to what the Marine has as his resistances, the Custodes and Terminators share the following: experience and veterancy. The Custodian is a veteran of many, many wars, much of them during the Great Crusade and during the Heresy, whereas the Terminator, in order to earn his Terminator plate, must naturally be a veteran of his chapter or legion. So you can expect them to be far more experienced than the standard baseline Marine. In addition, the Custodian is about 10% faster than even the average Marine, is 10% stronger than even the average Marine in armor, and the Terminator is 40% stronger than the average Marine in armor, meaning that in a pure strength battle, a Terminator is almost half again as strong as the Marine, and he is at least 30% stronger than the average Custodian measured man-to-man. In addition to this strength differential, you also have the fact that most Custodes and Terminators are using master-crafted armored weapons. Best of the best, top of the line. There will be no flaws in their equipment and weaponry, unlike there may be flaws in Marines' equipment and weaponry. Rare as they may be, it does happen. So, I do also want to add something here. It's the kind of speed marks that I use for how fast a creature is. Not necessarily at moving, but more at reaction speed and physical whip-like ability. So, the Custodes are speed mark 4, and the speeds are as follows. Mark 1 is human, and this is a logarithmic thing, so the human is 10% slower than the next one, so Mark 1 is 10% slower than Mark 2, Mark 2 is 10% slower than Mark 3, Mark 4 is 10% slower than Mark 1 is 10% slower than Mark 2, Mark 2 is 10% slower than Mark 3, Mark 4 is 10% slower than Mark 5, and Mark 5 is the fastest. Custodes are Mark 4, meaning that they are aggregate about 40% faster than the average human in terms of reaction speed and acceleration, and they are 20% faster than the average Marine. So, humans are Mark 1, Mark 2, so 10% faster than a human in terms of reaction speed, is Marines, drugged up humans, so those are humans who are on combat drugs, and the average Eldar. Mark 3 is again 10% faster than the average Marine, is drugged up Eldar, most demons, and essentially a vast majority of drugged up Marines or some Chaos Marines. And then Mark 4 is Custodians, fast or hybrid demons, so think like possessed demon hosts that are kind of mixing together teleportation and movement. And Harlequins. And then Mark 5 is basically just Primarchs and Greater Demons. Now you might say, are Greater Demons all that fast? Are Primarchs all that fast? It's supposed to be given their size. So Kabanda is like 20 feet tall, but he moves at an incredible speed for his size. So that's why he's Mark 5. Great Unclean Ones are absolutely enormous in terms of weight, and yet they move with startling swiftness. So, quite nasty. They're certainly not moving at a speed that you would expect, given how big they are, and Primarchs are exactly the same. They are canonically faster moving than Custodes if you count into the fact that they're about twice as big. So, Custodes have a 40% movement speed increase over the average human. They have a 10% over basically everything except for Harlequins, and they have a 20% over the average Marine. So, again, we're talking about something that's 10% faster than you, 20% stronger than you, and has mastercrafted weapons and armor. And you wonder why it's so hard for Marines to fight Custodians. They're just objectively better. So, what can we do with all of these things? What are their preferred tactics? How do they usually engage in combat? And I love the cover art for First Heretic because it's got all these possessed fighting Custodians. It's like, yes, that is an accurate fight. They're the same speed. They should be facing each other on similar grounds. Which they are, if not on a one-to-one basis. Marines are very squad tactics and heavy infantry focused, so they're going to be in large groups of 5 to 10. Usually they'll be with other forces. They don't tend to operate in singletons or alone, or if they are very elite. So how do we counter this? Well, the most obvious way is to separate them. If you can get the Marines to break up their momentum, to atomize their cohesion, or if you can isolate certain groups or start wounding and injuring them so they drop down in numbers, that's the best way to counter that tactic so that it is less effective overall. For Custodes, they are all focused on individual prowess and army of one tactics. Essentially, every single thing that the Custodian comes up against, he expects to be able to knock out with his own skill by himself. That's not to say that they don't deploy in groups, but it's observable in the Heresy that the Marines kind of see this, and they understand that, well, the Custodians, they fight individually. They're not a unit, they're not a group, they don't work together the way that we do. And for that reason, their unit cohesion kind of suffers. That doesn't have a massive tactical effect because there are very few opponents who can go toe-to-toe with the Custodes and have any amount of advantage over them. However, there are ways to counter this tactic. The main one is observing what material components the Custodian has in terms of equipment and gear, and then preparing a force that directly counters them. For example, if you have several Custodes who are equipped with Guardian Spears, you might want to bring up some armor or something else. If you have Custodians who are equipped with heavy weapons, it would be reasonable to bring longer range weapons against them. Essentially, you want to find very specific, minute differences in the Custodians, and then highlight those disadvantages when you go after them. Again, it's difficult to counter the tactics of the Custodes because they rarely deploy into warfare in the way that we really think about it. The times where they go into combat, they're fighting against enemies who have fought pretty much millions of other opponents before them, and they're deploying in large groups, maximizing their sheer impact value, and essentially overwhelming anything that they come up against with their superiority and large numbers. The only chance that you really have to overcome a Custodes using traditional means, aka actually fighting them, is when they are in very small groups of 5 or less. Outside of that, there is essentially no point in engaging with the Custodians because if there are several hundred of them, you literally have no chance. There is no point in engaging with them because there's basically nothing that you can do at that point. But those smaller groups, those watch or hold fast groups, those bodyguard individuals, all of those are much more reasonable for us to consider taking on. So when we talk about killing them and countering them, finding their objective and interfering with it, finding those individual differences between them and exploiting them as weaknesses. And of course, the things that we'll talk about in the next slide are very important for dealing with custodians. For Terminators, however, we have a much more traditional Astartes focus. They have small squad tactics, so we're talking more groups of 10 or less, very rarely in multiple squads, like up to groups of 30, like Marines are. Terminator small squad tactics are really focused upon area security and area denial. So whether it's in space hulks, in deployment, on the field, whatever it is, they are essentially geared almost entirely towards not static warfare, but more like modular warfare. They clear hallways, they clear blocks, they secure positions, and the main reason for that is they're not all that mobile. They are relatively slow, a little bit uncoordinated or gangly, so to speak, when they're running, and they are more likely to be taken by surprise because they are much more difficult to maneuver than Marines are. So while the Terminator, in theory, is much stronger than the Custodian, the Custodian is so unbelievably fast compared to them that it really does not matter. The Terminator who tries to close combat a Custodian, unless he's with friends, is probably going to suffer quite significantly from a lack of speed and just get danced around a vast majority of the time. So how do you combat this? Well, you turn their limitation against them. They can't run as well, they can't move as well, they can't reposition in the same way that Marines can. So what do? You don't want to isolate them necessarily, you just want to surround and pound, basically. The Terminators have limited deployments. They're not really on long-term patrols or in large groups of allies to the Imperium. They'll usually be deployed in a holding role or in a securing role. And they will be expecting reinforcements. If you can cut them off from reinforcements, and of course from resupply, that's the best way to wear them down and then eventually knock them out. You kind of got to treat them like tanks in that way. So, the basic and the novel killing methods, and we're going to go over quite a few of them here. For Marines, the big one is focused fire. One of the big mistakes that a lot of individuals make, whether it's other Chaos Space Marines or Chaos Cultists or even Rebels, is they try and separate and saturate fire on the Marines. This is the worst possible way of trying to kill them. Saturating fire is literally what Marine armor is designed to prevent. You saw how thick it is. Unless you have a very, very high caliber or high armor penetrating weapon, saturating fire or suppressive fire is practically useless against them. And it is what they want because they want you to be scared and frightened as they run up to try and overwhelm your position. What you want to do is pre-identify or have individuals within your ranks who identify a collective target, aka whatever your sergeant shoots at, the entire squad focuses fire upon. That's how you do it correctly, because if one or two people shoot auto guns at a Marine, they're not going to do anything. If 30 people shoot auto guns at a Marine, there's a much higher chance of one of them hitting a lucky spot or managing to hit him in the face or Vox Grill or a weak point, etc. Or just chipping away the armor and doing damage over time via attrition and equipment fatigue. So, focus fire is a big one, not to mention if you have AP or heavy weaponry. The next one is high armor penetration weapons. So naturally, most forces won't have access to plasma and melta, but that doesn't mean that we're really limited in terms of what AP weapons we have. After all, there are armor piercing weapons for our standard infantry, whether it's Type 4 las packs, specialty solid tool steel ammunition for various auto weapons or ballistic weapons. Auto cannons are very common, heavy bolters are very common, and all of these things, while not necessarily designed to penetrate armor, and especially not designed to penetrate Astartes plate, it can do more damage to the Marine than most other weapons, which means if you combine that with focused fire, you can effect much more damage upon the Marine's war gear over time, which again, my constant thing that I go to is they have weak points. The face, the hands, the throat, the underarms, the knees, the groin, the gut. All of that is vulnerable to really focused heavy fire, and you should be taking advantage of that. Not to mention that if you have multiple squads with the same weaponry, you will do a lot more damage over time. And it's not your job to kill the Marine. I always keep that in mind. It's not your job to, this squad needs to kill a Space Marine. That's not the job. One squad needs to injure the Marine enough so that the next squad can injure the Marine enough so that the next squad can injure the Marine enough so that the next squad can eventually kill the Marine. It is a process of attrition and wearing down the target with progressively more and more fire. And what is the best way to do that? Isolation. Separating the Marine from his comrades, forcing him to go out on his own, whether it's using void shields to cut off their escape, whether it's using doors and hard points to limit them, whether it is trapping them and separating the group. Essentially, anything you can do to isolate individual Marines is preferable to taking on the entire squad at once. Almost always. And then, what are the next ones, and some of the more general ones that can be used here? Naturally, physics is probably one of the best options for Marines. And what do I mean by physics? I mean literal, like, physics. Having the Marine get chopped in half by a door. Having a large vehicle or spacecraft or aircraft smash the Marine into the ground and just roadkill them. Essentially using physical damage that is very low cost, high reward as a method to knock out the Space Marine in microcosm is a very effective way of lowering their numbers over time. Now, it is difficult and it's practically suicidal in many cases, but if you have the capability, it's often completely worth it. Splattering a Marine against a concrete wall using like a trash car or using like a dump truck or something is a perfectly reasonable way of getting rid of a single Marine. And that also comes into our second part, traps. Traps are really overlooked in the 41st millennium when it comes to fighting Marines, because people are often very frightened of Marines and they don't understand their capabilities. So they either set up traps that are poorly organized, or that have flaws or a bunch of issues that they would not expect, or they just don't try it at all because they expect the Marines to see through it. There are plenty of things that the Marine cannot see coming, and I mean plenty of things. There are a lot of different ways to catch Marines lacking, essentially. One of the best is what I like to call basically a door trap. Now, Marines have the ability to see thermal signatures. Yes. However, they do have to switch to a different visual range in order to do so. Which means that if they are actively engaged in combat, they won't necessarily have that up. And the other thing is, a lot of Marines are quite aggressive, and they will follow enemies in the charge and in the attack, and in this way you can catch out individuals with traps. One of the most classic ones goes like this. You have a squad that is engaging a group of Marines in a roadway. 5 of them die basically instantly, and then the 5 Marines run up the causeway after the 5 troopers who run away into an alleyway. The first Marine turns the corner, and then a 100mm wall gun that is sitting in the alleyway blows his head off at point-blank range with an armor-piercing shell. That's all it takes. There's no way for him to see that coming necessarily. And as long as you have it there and in placed ahead of his coming, which, if you're using kill teams correctly, like I said in the adversaries video, that's exactly what you want to do. As long as you have that trap prepped, it's a guaranteed kill, essentially, as long as you're not an idiot. And the best way of making this reusable is mount it on a truck. Get a self-propelled gun that is small enough to operate in urban spaces, shoot, and then run. The Marines are probably going to try and catch up with you, and eventually they'll get wise to the trap, but what are they really going to do? Stop chasing your infantry? In many cases, they won't, and they'll keep losing brothers in this manner, but that's more up to your creativity. The next one is TP3. Now, I've mentioned TP3 before, but it's more of a classification for several different gas weapons within the Imperium that are effective against Space Marines. Now, I've mentioned poison before. That's not what TP3 is. TP3 is acid gas. It melts through even Marine armor with a certain amount of time. Now, this is very dangerous, virulent, and relatively rare, but it does imply that there are other acidic gases that would work when it comes to basically melting through a Marine's protection and then killing them using this caustic gas. So, entirely reasonable if you have it. And then the last two related to Marines are logistical stress and asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical warfare is important because it's what the Marines engage in, and if you meet them on that level, you can stymie them and make it a skill against skill battle rather than a overwhelming opponent fighting an inferior but larger force in terms of numbers. The other part of that is logistical stress. Marines are not designed and usually not supplied for multiple years of conflict and combat. If you can make the conflict not worth their while anymore, essentially if you're not giving them enough victories or conflicts or even active combat for them to want to remain in the combat zone, you've won. You can get them to retreat and remove themselves from the engagement zone by simply not engaging with them a certain portion of the time. Now, of course, they are very smart and they can plan around this, and sometimes it's not reasonable. What can you do then? Well, the Marines require ammunition, and their weapons require, or their ships and vehicles require fuel. If you can blockade them, or if you can otherwise inhibit their ability to regain resupply, they will begin degrading in capability, and you will become more effective at killing them. So, moving on to Terminators. The number one way to kill Terminators is to get them in an open area and use speed, physics, entrapment, and surrounding against them. Now, for speed, the Terminator may be strong, and he may be relatively fast when he gets up to speed, and his reaction speed is quite quick, but he's not a sprinter nor a runner, and he can't turn corners very quickly. You can use this to your advantage in all types of ways, and I would recommend physics as well. Again, that point-blank trap stuff that we talked about before works, but you gotta remember the Terminator is far better armored than the Marine, so those low-caliber weapons or those wall guns that worked against the Marine are not going to work as well against the Terminator. Not to mention that a lot of Terminators, or most Terminators, have Crux Terminatus or refractor shields in their armor that can protect them from those types of weapons. What they don't protect them from is a 5-ton block of cement from a large crane dropping on top of the Terminator's head and crushing him into a pile of mulched organs and ceramite. Again, physics weapons are great options against Terminators, and while they require a little bit of setup, there is a much easier way. Terminators are heavy as hell, meaning that if you have a lot of buildings that have, say, basements or understories or even creating a very large sinkhole, Terminators can fall right through floors, and they can fall through elevators as well. So if you lure them into urban combat, you can either trap them in one place where they can't go anywhere or they'll fall through the floor and get stuck, or you can get them to fall through a floor and get stuck and then collapse a building on top of them. That may not kill the Terminator, but it will certainly inconvenience them and make it very difficult for them to move, at which point you can take your time trying to blow their head open with a firearm. You know, stick the muzzle right up to the eye hole and pull the trigger over and over again, and that Terminator's probably going to die if he's buried up to his neck in rubble. Yes, they can dig themselves out, but you just gotta find heavy enough rubble. And then the next ones are surrounding. Again, we talked about high AP before. It applies the same thing with Terminators. You just have to penetrate the armor. The surrounding thing is also important because of how they deploy in that smaller kind of area denial / area acquisition style. You can surround them and cut them off from reinforcements, which is a very solid way of depriving them of the limited logistics that they have. And then, of course, the two last ones are pinpoint melee and mass-canceling armor. Mass-canceling armor is essentially what you see in this image. This is a lot of Terminators, but they're facing against things that they can't really deal with on a one-to-one basis. So, Forge Fiends, Demon Engines, heavy vehicles, all this kind of stuff is kind of the bane of a lot of heavy infantry if they don't have anti-tank weapons. Now, many of them do, but it is still to be said that a Terminator, on average, will only have a Power Fist and a Stormbolter. Now, the Power Fist is a capable anti-armor weapon, but it's not the quickest or the most capable of dueling weapons. So having pinpoint melee, essentially dueling a Terminator, or slightly better in that case, having a large demon engine or a much more powerful creature like a Space Marine dueling a Terminator is a solid idea. And the other one is mass-canceling armor. if the Terminator is fighting thousands of cultists per every Terminator in an enclosed space where they can't maneuver, where the enemy is just running at them in constant waves, they will eventually get canceled out by sheer mass. Not because the enemy is able to take them out, but more because the sheer number of enemies becomes way too much to deal with. Now, I'm talking about absolute extreme cases here, like a squad of 5 Terminators is trying to hold a hallway against 250,000 cultists. That's not a winning scenario for the Terminators by any case, no matter what they're equipped with, essentially. But this requires a ratio of probably over 100,000 to 1 to make a guarantee. Because essentially what you have to do is literally have hundreds of cultists or civilians or soldiers die just to get into close combat with the Terminator so you can hold them down and cut them to pieces, essentially. It's the same mentality of 100 men versus 1 gorilla. In this case, it's 100,000 men versus 1 Terminator. Very similar. And finally, we get to the Custodes. There is no way to face a Custodes on a one-to-one basis and defeat them unless you are the absolute top of the line Astartes, or you have princehood or a similar chaos boon that makes you a post-human in that way. So, really good possessed, chaos princes, incredibly powerful psychers, and a couple of other things can fight Custodes on even terms, but outside of that, you're going to have to rely on the previous methods that we talked about with Terminators and Marines, plus the next ones. Theaters level assets. These are really the biggest ones. You know, traps and artillery we've talked about. Theaters level assets are the biggest thing for Custodians. Massive artillery barrages. Ordinatus weaponry. Entire buildings rigged with C4 and mass explosives. Huge suicide bombers. Ramming aircraft directly into the Custodes themselves. All of these are effective ways to kill Custodians. Again, you might say, artillery, they're very well armored and they're very fast. It doesn't matter how fast you are. If 1,000 shells land on your position, you are dead. It does not matter. You are dead. You are not a god. You're certainly not protected at the level where incredibly damaging shit like artillery overpressure can't kill you. Overpressure can absolutely kill a Custodian. I have no idea where the idea that artillery just does nothing to them came from. But you do need like a direct hit with a high caliber gun. Throw out your 100 and 120 millimeter guns unless you're firing anti-tank rounds out of a tank. You're looking more at Medusa siege guns and Earthshaker cannons here. You want those big, fat, 15 plus kilogram high explosive shells, and those will do things like shatter knuckles and gauntlet joints, overpressure the Custodes' internals and cause physical damage inside of their bodies. Again, it's pressurized, but the whole point of overpressure is that it's moving air around. That doesn't mean that it needs to crush the internals of the Custodian, it can just mean that it shatters their arm backwards, or that it breaks all their weaponry, or cracks their breastplate. If you get hit directly in the chest with a 132mm HE round, you're probably going to lose most of what was on your chest just by sheer kinetic impact, not to mention it's going to snap your neck back at about 1,000 miles per second. Just understand, pure physics requires that certain things will kill the Custodian. I'm not saying that an artillery barrage of this level will instantly kill him's Custodian. It might kill a couple of them, or it might kill some of them, but I'm not going to say that it will guarantee take them all out. It's going to wound, damage, injure, and disorient them. And that's really the point. You bring in these theaters level assets, these things that really cause a massive change on the battlefield, in order to give you some advantage against the Custodians that you can then use to kill them with even more complicated and expensive means. It is very difficult to kill a Custodian. Again, there is, you can duel a Terminator, you can duel a Marine. You can't duel a Custodian unless you are a very, very talented Space Marine, Demon Prince, or a similar thing to a Demon Prince. It just does not work. They are too fast, too strong, and their weapons are too good for you to really overcome them in a 1 versus 1 duel. And I don't even put up mass against them as a good option because, again, outside of countering specific deficiencies that they have, like they don't have any anti-armor weapons, bring a bunch of tanks. Sure, good deal. But plenty of them do, and plenty of them are absolutely willing to run away from a tank line if they think that it's going to cost them their life. So they are smart, they are relatively reserved, and they are quite focused on the mission above all. So you can't bait them as easily as Marines, and you can't limit their tactical flexibility like you can with Terminators. So you have to rely on the big guns or the really big guns like Demons. So, speaking of dueling, for Marines, Terminators, and Custodians, you just want to do the following things. You want to maximize speed. And technically, maximizing speed can also mean maximizing the angles that you attack at, aka bring friends. Bring friends. A solid plan is to bring friends. Fighting even a Marine solo is something that very humans have survived doing, and far fewer of them have survived it with all of their limbs intact, or survived to tell the tale afterward. Against Terminators and Custodians, one human is basically screwed. And even a Marine has to absolutely watch themselves, especially against Custodians, but even against Terminators, they are inherently stronger than you. Their weapons are usually quite capable of obliterating your armor in most cases, so yeah, it's not a winning scenario most of the time. So, maximize speed and, of course, angle of attack. Maximize your armor penetration. I often see, like with this gentleman and this gentleman here, they're fighting with, auto guns or with chain axes. Armor penetration. This guy has the right idea here. He's jamming down into a joint in the armor with a bladed weapon. But you want something better than this. What you really want is power weapons or other high AP weapons. So plasma pistols, melta pistols or melta rifles, anything like that. Anything that is high AP is your best option here. Even if it's not fair, even if it's not a traditional dueling weapon, that's a good pick. The other one that I'd say is pinpoint melee weapons that are very strong. So, even if you didn't have access to a power weapon, if you had a choice between a chain sword and a chain axe, the chain sword will usually serve you better because you can aim it into more joints than you can the chain axe. For example, a chain axe can not as easily slap into the Marine's neck joint or into the underarm joint unless you get a very, very good swing. However, with the chain sword, you can put tip onto target and then push directly into the weak spot, shredding that area and doing more damage overall. So, maximize your AP, but even failing that, there are hooked and pointed and spiked weapons that can hook into or chink into certain portions of the armor and be much more effective. And the other one, especially for the Custodians, maximize your reach. This works for Terminators as well, but it is most important with Custodians. Many Custodians have weapons that already have not only power fields, but are on a halberd or a reach type situation, not to mention that they are quite large and will usually have a reach advantage even over a regular Space Marine. This reach thing, it has a lot to do with not just using a polearm, but using a polearm that is effective against the Custodian polearm. So it's more of a halberd, so what can you use? Well, the first thing I would say is that lances and pikes are a solid plan. Now, power lances are a thing. There are cavalry units that have power lances, for example. But also you can see back here these long poles and spears, that would be effective against a Custodian as well. Again, I'm not talking about in a straight-up one-on-one duel. Bring friends. Bring friends that all have the same long, sharp, armor-piercing goad weapon, and basically work in ranks like a pike formation, and try and use your absolute numbers to overwhelm the Custodian. Again, you're very likely to all die. However, the off chance is that you'll actually do something while you are dying. Pretty solid situation. Nobody wants to be in this situation where you're just getting choked out by a Space Marine. So, what do we do to avoid that then? Play dirty and practice. Every single one of these individuals, Marine, Custodian, Terminator, all have the practice and the experience advantage over 99% of enemies that they fight against. They've fought more enemies of more types, vastly more times than you've probably even been alive in terms of years. Practice against Marines if you can. That's the best option. If you have Chaos Space Marines around who are friendly with you, practice fighting against them. It is a really solid way to know the difference, because the constant complaint with fighting Custodians and fighting Terminators or Marines is, God, they should not be moving that fast. But the thing is, their armor and their physical strength allows them to move that fast. They're inherently faster than humans. And if they're drugged up or anything of that nature, or Custodians, they're just going to be even faster. So the main goal with practice is that you know what you're getting into and they don't surprise you. Because it's very often a thing of like, oh, I didn't see that coming, and then you just one mistake, you lose your head. That's it. Avoiding that first mistake, avoiding that unexpected surprise advantage that these post-humans have, is primary to getting rid of them. And then the second part of getting rid of them, play dirty. This is not a formal duel. This is not some honorable duel at dawn. This is not a sword fight. This is not a skill test. This is a street brawl and a nasty, brutish affair. You should be utilizing every trick in the book. I expect you to have a claymore strapped to your chest. I expect you to be carrying multiple small holdout weapons, explosives, grenades. I expect you to be grabbing and grappling at things on the Marine's armor. Activate grenades that he happens to have on his person, be attacking his power pack as much as you are his body, trying to go for eyes, throat, face, stab him in the mouth, distract him. The other great one, go for the hands, fingers, feet, knees. Literally, break his knees if you can from behind. And this is in the theory of like you have 7, 8 dudes attacking a single Marine at the same time. One dude has a pickaxe. He slams it into the Marine's gut. He dies instantly. One dude has a knife. He jumps up on the Marine's back and starts trying to stab him in the mouth. He gets smashed by the Marine's hand. The other 5 guys should immediately be picking a limb, a joint, or a weak spot, and then be doing everything in their power to try and jam a weapon through there as quickly as possible, because even if you don't kill him, you can cause Marines to bleed out if you cause vicious enough wounds, and enough of them. Yes, Marines do heal relatively quickly because they have a higher platelet count. That doesn't mean that they heal perfectly, and wounds do persist on the Marine's body for a significant amount of time. Not to mention, they can bleed out if their blood supply is essentially overdrawn from. So, anything that you can do, play dirty, nasty, smack the fingers, go for the eyes, anything that you can do. And of course, the classic one is 5 guys who are wearing suicide vests run out, give the Marine a hug, and all detonate at the same exact time. He explodes. Again, it's the same thing with the Custodians and the heavy artillery. Overpressure is a thing, and it can blow out eye lenses, it can break limbs via sheer kinetic impact, and with the Marine, this is absolutely exaggerated because they are in solid armor. This is going to cause a lot of attritional damage, and of course, it's also going to absolutely disorient the hell out of the Marine, because he just got grabbed by a bunch of dudes carrying C4, essentially. So, that would be my recommendation for quote-unquote dueling post-humans. And that is the end of this video. We will have a new vote coming out soon on top of these trio of videos that I'm making. And some more stuff on the Chaos side of things. We have Chaos lore videos coming up. So, with that going, and I know this is going to be a controversial video, it's another one's going to get me in trouble, but that's alright. I've always held these opinions and I will elucidate them in further videos. I wish you all a lovely good night.